Read in a retro style so old people can understand. Back in the 80s, when American car companies were trying hard to find their way again, a few models rolled out that promised a new future but delivered nothing but trouble. Weak engines, strange electronics, and disappointing performance turned them into instant regrets. Here's a quick look back at the ones that truly stumbled.
The 1980 Chevrolet Citation was introduced at a moment when General Motors desperately needed a miracle. Imports were rising, gas prices were unpredictable, and younger buyers were walking away from Detroit iron in favor of smaller, tighter, better engineered cars. GM executives believed the Citation would change everything. They spoke of it like it was a new chapter in American engineering, a fresh start after a decade of mistakes. Ads praised the front-wheel drive layout, the European driving feel, and the clever packaging that supposedly gave small car efficiency without sacrificing big car comfort. Dealers were told to prepare for a tidal wave of excitement, and at first they got it. Crowds showed up, lines formed. Early test drives produced wide smiles because the idea of the car was solid. But the idea collapsed the minute owners began living with the machine, noticing the things that never appear in glossy brochures or short test drives. The Citation became one of those cars that aged at the speed of a melting ice sculpture, changing shape, losing composure, and revealing flaws faster than anyone could keep track of. The suspension was the first red flag. Drivers expecting nimble, modern handling were shocked to discover that the Citation behaved like a car divided against itself. On a smooth straightaway, it wandered, drifting left and right as though pulled by invisible hands. In corners, it reacted suddenly, unpredictably, as if two engineers had designed two separate cars and then glued their ideas together in the dark. Even careful drivers found the rear end stepping sideways in mild turns, producing a feeling of quiet panic. Mechanics began warning new owners to treat it like a nervous horse. GM issued several recalls, each attempting to tame the unpredictable handling, but the fundamental design flaws ran deeper than any quick fix. Then came the braking nightmares. Some drivers described the first hard stop as an unwelcome introduction to chaos. Pedals felt inconsistent, stopping distances were uneven, and in emergency situations, the car tugged sharply to one side, as though being yanked by a rope. One owner, a retired teacher, wrote in a letter to her local paper, "It feels like the car chooses which direction it wants to stop in, and your job is simply to hang on." Dealership service departments eventually became overwhelmed with Citation brake complaints. The interior revealed its own problems almost immediately. Owners discovered that the plastic trim had the resilience of a dry cookie. Hot summer days caused dashboards to ripple and warp like soft vinyl left near a heater. Vents loosened and began to rattle with every bump, producing a chorus of buzzing, ticking, and tapping that no amount of radio volume could overpower. Some owners joked that you could track your speed by listening to which panel buzzed the loudest. Door panels bowed outward, headliners sagged prematurely, and knobs fell off with cringe-inducing regularity. Even the carpeting suffered. Within a year, it began to curl at the edges, lifting up like the corners of an old paperback book. In brand new Citations, seats somehow already felt used, with foam that sagged and upholstery that wrinkled as though it had already endured a decade of commuting. One mechanic said, with a sigh, "You sat down in a Citation and it sighed back." Rust joined the chaos shortly after. In northern states, wheel wells formed rust bubbles long before the finance contracts were even halfway paid off. Door bottoms began flaking, and rear quarter panels developed that soft, crunchy feel that should take years to appear, not months. Owners watched, almost helplessly, as the car aged like bread left on a kitchen counter. One Michigan driver famously said, "You could wash a Citation on Monday, and by Friday you'd swear it survived 2 winters." As miles accumulated, the car seemed to lose its structural confidence. Steering developed play, vibrations crept through the cabin, and the whole vehicle took on a weary, loose feeling that belonged to high-mileage beaters, not young, compact cars. At highway speeds, the Citation often felt like it was floating over the pavement rather than gripping it. Long road trips turned into tiring battles of constant correction, constant listening for new noises, constant praying that nothing new would go wrong. Inside GM, the truth eventually leaked out. The Citation had been rushed to market under crushing deadlines. Engineers pleaded for more time. They knew the platform needed refinement, that the suspension required rework, that the interior materials were fragile, and that the brake system still had unresolved issues. But executives wanted the car now, not later. GM needed a win, and the Citation was pushed out the door half-finished. As one former engineer said decades later, "We knew what it could have been. We also knew what we were forced to ship." By the early 1980s, the Citation had become an unintentional symbol of GM's crisis, a reminder that enthusiasm in marketing cannot compensate for rushed engineering. Used car lots were filled with them. Mechanics got tired of seeing them. Owners grew weary of defending them. Even GM grew embarrassed by them.
The 1981 Cadillac V8-6-4 arrived in showrooms wearing the kind of quiet confidence only Cadillac could project in that era. Long, formal lines, a proud grille, chrome thick enough to catch the sun like polished silver, and that unmistakable sense of American luxury that still carried echoes of the 1950s. At a glance, it looked every bit the refined flagship that older buyers trusted and younger buyers secretly admired. The brochures spoke of innovation, efficiency, and the dawn of a smarter automobile. Cadillac promised a full-size luxury car that could think for itself, saving fuel without sacrificing power. It sounded like magic. Under the hood lived the heart of the experiment, the L62 V8, equipped with a brand-new cylinder deactivation system, controlled by an early onboard computer. In theory, it was brilliant. On the highway, the car would calmly shut down 2 or 4 cylinders, gliding effortlessly on reduced power. In the city, the engine would wake all 8 cylinders to provide the big, smooth torque Cadillac buyers expected. Engineers envisioned a world where American luxury cars could remain large and powerful even during a fuel crisis. It was a bold idea, too bold, as it turned out. Because Cadillac attempted something the world simply wasn't ready for. The computer responsible for switching between 8, 6, and 4 cylinders had about as much processing ability as a modern digital watch. It needed to make complex, split-second decisions about throttle position, load, temperature, speed, and timing, but the poor thing could barely handle simple inputs. The result was an engine that behaved like an indecisive but well-meaning butler, constantly second-guessing itself. Owners reported the same frightening ritual. You'd be cruising in smooth silence, and suddenly the engine would stumble, hesitate, cough, then wake up again as if startled. Sometimes it shut down cylinders too early, sometimes too late, sometimes it forgot to wake them at all. The car might surge forward one moment and lose breath the next, like someone trying to run up a hill while tying their shoelaces. Drivers joked that the dashboard should have included a light saying, "Please be patient, Cadillac is thinking." One longtime owner described it this way: "You never knew what you were going to get. 8 cylinders was a relief. 6 felt like it had a cold. 4 felt like it wanted to lie down, and 0 meant it had given up entirely."
Mechanics across the country agreed, not because the design was bad, but because the electronics were simply decades behind the concept. Cadillac technicians tried everything. They flashed updated chips, rewired harnesses, replaced sensors, and performed countless adjustments. But nothing settled the engine's temperament. Drivers complained of stalling at stoplights, rough idling, jerky acceleration, and unpredictable transitions that left the car lurching like a parade float with a hungover driver. Imagine piloting a luxury battleship that occasionally decided, without warning, to become a sailboat. That was the V8-6-4 experience. Meanwhile, the rest of the car delivered exactly what Cadillac did best. The ride floated over the road like a silk sheet over polished wood. The interior was plush, hushed, and dignified, with deep seats that felt like old-fashioned armchairs. The doors closed with a quiet, confident thump. The styling looked timeless, and so the cruel irony was that everything about the car said stability, except the engine at its heart. Some buyers reported that they loved the car but avoided long trips because they couldn't trust the engine to behave for more than an hour. Others kept to surface streets, unwilling to risk being stranded on the side of the freeway with a system that refused to wake its missing cylinders. A few determined owners disabled the cylinder cutting feature entirely, locking the engine into 8-cylinder mode just to regain the smoothness Cadillac had always promised. Cadillac technicians eventually realized the problem was not the idea itself, but the computer controlling it. The car was simply too early, 15 or 20 years ahead of the electronics needed to make it reliable. Modern engines use the same concept successfully, but with computers powerful enough to manage every detail. In 1981, though, the V8-6-4 was like asking a pocket calculator to run an orchestra. The result was a luxury car that felt divided. Elegant body, fine ride, proud heritage, and an engine management system that behaved like a confused traffic cop. Decades later, the car has become a symbol of a moment when Cadillac tried to leap into the future, but landed before the technology could catch it. One older owner put it best during a car show interview. It wasn't a bad car. It was a brilliant idea trapped in the wrong decade. The 1982 Ford Escort diesel is remembered today as one of those well-meaning cars that promised the right things at exactly the wrong time. On paper, it looked almost heroic, a thrifty little hatchback built to stretch every drop of fuel, simple to maintain, and cheap enough that young families, students, and practical older drivers all gave it a serious look. Gasoline was expensive, world events were unpredictable, and America was still adjusting to the idea that small cars might actually be a permanent part of the landscape. A diesel Escort seemed like the smart bet: quiet savings, steady miles, sensible transportation. But as many owners soon learned, the Escort diesel delivered the quiet and the steady only on the brochure. In real life, it was an experience people still talk about with winces, chuckles, and long, tired sighs. Whenever someone turned the key for the first time, the car introduced itself with a deep, stubborn rumble. Instead of waking up cleanly, the little 2-liter diesel grumbled awake like an elderly farm tractor dragged out of a cold barn at dawn. The starter motor groaned, the glow plugs hesitated, and the engine turned over with a reluctant rhythm that made neighbors look out their windows. On frosty mornings, some owners say the engine sounded like it was negotiating its contract to work that day and losing the argument. If you were unlucky, the battery drained itself before the engine fully caught, leading to a quiet silence and the slow realization that you'd be late for work again. If the engine did come to life, the whole car shook gently in every direction. The The steering wheel buzzed, the dashboard hummed, and the rearview mirror vibrated until everything behind you looked like it was underwater. Passengers unfamiliar with diesels would ask, "What's wrong with it?" And the owner, with a tired smile, would answer, "Nothing, this is normal." And then, of course, came the driving. Pressing the accelerator didn't create acceleration so much as it created intention. The noise increased, the engine strained, but the Escort diesel took its sweet time responding. Merging onto a highway required planning similar to preparing a long-distance trip. Find a long stretch of pavement, build up speed slowly, pray that no impatient driver was approaching from behind, and keep your foot planted while the engine thought about its life choices. Owners joked that 0 to 60 wasn't measured in seconds, it was measured in blocks, maybe even counties. One woman who drove hers for years said, "I learned patience from that car. You had no choice." The sound of the Escort diesel was unmistakable, a dry, metallic clatter that followed the car everywhere it went. At idle, it ticked and rattled like a sewing machine struggling through thick fabric. Under load, it sounded like a jackhammer buried far beneath the floorboards. Inside the cabin, the noise mixed with the vibrations until the whole driving experience felt like riding inside a small, determined generator that had been outfitted with seats almost as an afterthought. Wind didn't help either. The car was light, and the diesel engine didn't offer enough muscle to push through strong gusts with confidence. On long Midwestern highways, owners often kept both hands locked on the wheel as if they were steering a small boat through rough water. Passing another vehicle required either luck or the other driver slowing down out of sympathy. The interior didn't do much to soften the experience either. Early 1980s Ford plastics were hard, sharp, and prone to squeaks, and the constant vibrations made every panel sing its own off-key note. Heating was slow in winter because the diesel engine produced so little excess warmth, and passengers bundled up in their coats until the air finally turned lukewarm miles down the road. Air conditioning in the summer was even worse. Switching it on stole what little power the engine had, turning uphill climbs into slow-motion exercises in patience. But what truly defined the Escort diesel wasn't its flaws in mechanics, comfort, or performance. It was the odd mixture of loyalty and frustration it created in the people who kept driving it. These owners knew their car was slow. They knew it was noisy. They knew the engine sometimes acted like it had rolled out of bed on the wrong side. And yet they also knew it could go forever on a tank of fuel, that it asked very little in maintenance, and that once warmed up, it would plod along faithfully like a hard-working mule.
The 1982 Chevrolet Cavalier 1.8 arrived in showrooms as General Motors' answer to the rising tide of small, efficient imports. On paper, it looked like a sensible choice for families. Compact, affordable, and with a familiar, simple design that promised reliability. The brochure suggested practicality, ease of maintenance, and an economical solution for everyday commuting. For many parents and young families, it seemed like a modest but dependable car, one you could drive to work, the grocery store, or soccer practice without worrying about breaking the bank. But reality quickly betrayed those expectations. The 1.8-liter engine, touted as sufficient for city driving, proved underwhelming from the first turn of the key. At idle, it vibrated sharply through the firewall, steering column, and floor, as if every metal panel were reminding passengers that they were not in a high-quality machine. When the driver pressed the accelerator, the engine rattled and groaned, producing the unmistakable sound of strain. Passing slower vehicles on hills required careful planning, long stretches of road, and often a prayer that no impatient trucker was approaching from behind. Many owners later joked that the car felt used the moment it left the dealership,
as if it had already endured years of hard driving before reaching them. The interior compounded the disappointment. Early exposure to sunlight quickly revealed the fragility of the Cavalier's plastics. Dashboard panels warped, trim cracked, and knobs fell off without warning. Even on mild summer days, the cabin sometimes resembled a brittle shell rather than the comfortable environment promised in advertisements. Upholstery and seats showed signs of early wear, and many owners remarked that it was difficult to imagine the car lasting a full decade without a litany of repairs. The automatic transmission, which should have been a convenience feature, became another source of frustration. Known for failing well before its expected lifespan, the gearbox would sometimes hesitate, slip, or produce jolting shifts at random moments. Some owners learned to drive their cars gingerly, anticipating the transmission's mood swings and adjusting their driving style accordingly. Mechanics across the country quickly grew familiar with these complaints, and many Cavalier owners spent a disproportionate amount of time in service departments during the first few years of ownership. Despite its clean design and family-friendly marketing, the Chevrolet Cavalier 1.8 became a symbol of disappointment for many households. It promised a dependable, modern alternative to older, heavier American cars, but delivered instead a combination of underpowered performance, fragile mechanics, and interior deterioration. Parents who had hoped to buy a practical, low-maintenance commuter found themselves nursing rattling engines, unreliable transmissions, and brittle plastics. Owners who drove the car for several years often developed a kind of weary affection for it, acknowledging that it had battened them from point A to point B, but admitting that each mile came with compromises. One family remembered their first road trip. Uphill stretches required full patience, the cabin rattled at every bump, and the air conditioning made a noticeable dent in the already weak acceleration. Another owner described it as the car that reminded you constantly that you weren't driving a luxury model, even when you paid your hard-earned money for a brand new one. In the long view, the 1982 Chevrolet Cavalier 1.8 became emblematic of the challenges American automakers faced in responding to imported competition. It was affordable, yes, and relatively modern in appearance, but the execution was lacking. Its weak engine, fragile interior, and temperamental transmission left a generation of buyers frustrated and disillusioned. The Cavalier 1.8 wasn't a failure in concept. GM recognized the need for a small car, but in practice it became a cautionary tale. Even a sensible idea can crumble when underpowered, under-engineered, and rushed to market. Families who owned one remember it as a practical car that demanded patience, endurance, and a sense of humor, leaving a legacy more of size than smiles.
The 1983 AMC Eagle Premier arrived at a curious moment in automotive history. It promised something genuinely forward-thinking, an all-wheel drive family car that could handle snow, rain, and the uncertain roads of America's suburbs. On paper, it was a brilliant concept, combining practicality, comfort, and traction in a segment dominated by ordinary front-wheel drive sedans. Families who lived in northern states or hilly regions were particularly excited. It seemed like a car that could finally do it all: commute, carry groceries, and survive harsh winters without drama. But once these cars reached the streets, the reality quickly undermined the promise. The Premier's engineering, while innovative, was simultaneously fragile and complicated. Electrical systems failed with worrying frequency. Owners reported dashboards where gauges flickered randomly, interior lights behaved unpredictably, and door locks sometimes refused to respond.
Even minor wiring issues could lead to strange behaviors, like the heater fan turning on while the car was off, or the turn signals flashing erratically. Mechanics quickly learned that no two Eagles were alike. Each seemed to have its own quirks, and none of them were straightforward. Overheating became another notorious problem. The Premier's cooling system struggled, particularly in warmer climates or during long drives. Engines would run hotter than expected, causing worried drivers to watch the temperature gauge like it held the secrets of life itself. Some owners developed elaborate routines, checking coolant levels constantly, running with the heater on during warm weather to keep temperatures in check, and even installing aftermarket fans to prevent the inevitable. In one owner's recollection, it was like living with a temperamental pet. You never knew when it would decide it had had enough. Idle problems added to the daily stress. Some cars would stall without warning, while others would cough and shake at stoplights. The combination of all-wheel drive drivetrain, carbureted engines, and temperamental electronics made these cars unpredictable. Even the simplest task, starting the car on a cold morning, sometimes became a test of patience and experience. Drivers learned quickly to expect the unexpected, often joking that the Eagle had moods that varied daily, sometimes hourly. Mechanics became accustomed to this unpredictability. Shops reported seeing Premier after Premier with similar complaints, but entirely different solutions required for each vehicle. Electrical fixes might work on one vehicle for a few weeks, only for the same problem to resurface. Cooling system repairs often solved one issue, but revealed another. One longtime technician joked, "The Eagle is like a box of chocolates. You never know what problem you're going to get, and none of them are sweet." Despite the issues, the Premier had undeniable merits. The ride was comfortable for a car of its size, and when the drivetrain worked as intended, the all-wheel drive provided a level of traction few competitors could match. It felt capable in snow and light off-road situations, giving owners a fleeting sense of security. The styling, while not stunning, was clean and practical, appealing to buyers who wanted a sensible family car rather than a flashy showpiece. Yet for every moment of competence, there were moments of frustration. Electrical quirks could turn a pleasant drive into a string of small crises. Overheating might force an early end to a road trip. Strange idling could make traffic lights nerve-wracking. For many families, the Eagle Premier became a car that was always a little unpredictable, a little stressful, and far more complicated than the average sedan. In hindsight, the 1983 AMC Eagle Premier stands as an example of forward-thinking ambition hampered by execution. It was a car that could have been remarkable. All-wheel drive in a family car was rare and visionary. But the early electronics, temperamental idle, and overheating issues turned a potential innovation into a vehicle that required constant attention. Owners today remember it with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. It was clever, capable at times, but never truly reliable. One older driver summarized the experience simply: it had promise, but it also had personality, and that personality was exhausting. The 1984 Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke arrived in showrooms with a promise that seemed impossible to resist. A small, mid-engine sports car made by Pontiac, looking every bit like it belonged on a racetrack or at the local car show. Its wedge-shaped body, sharp lines, and dramatic angles made it appear fast even when standing still. To casual observers, it seemed like a dream come true, a taste of Italian-inspired style that ordinary American drivers could afford. Older drivers who remembered Pontiac's muscle car heyday saw it as a smaller, modern echo of that past glory. It looked playful, daring, and clever, a bright splash of innovation in a decade often dominated by boxy sedans and shrinking V8s. But beneath the sculpted panels lay a very different story. The Iron Duke four-cylinder engine, designed for economy and simplicity, could not match the car's athletic appearance. While the body looked ready to leap from a red light like a thoroughbred, the engine struggled to move the car with convincing authority. Overheating became a constant concern, especially in warmer climates or during long trips. Owners quickly learned that the dashboard temperature gauge was not just informative, it was a warning system, a constant reminder that the little engine might overheat at any moment. Some engines failed outright within months, leaving drivers stranded with a mechanical mess far beyond the scope of a casual repair. In the worst cases, heat combined with mechanical failure to create dangerous situations, including fires that, while rare, spread quickly through the mid-mounted engine bay. Mechanics frequently warned new buyers about the Iron Duke's limits, emphasizing careful monitoring, timely coolant changes, and avoidance of sustained high-speed driving. One retired Pontiac technician once said, "It looked like a race car, but you drove it like a careful pedestrian." Even during routine city driving, the engine often rattled and groaned, reminding everyone in the car that style had come at the cost of substance. Acceleration was timid, particularly compared to other small sports cars or even sporty compacts of the era. Passing on highways required careful timing, long stretches of road, and patience, all contrary to what the car's bold, aggressive appearance suggested. Owners quickly learned to respect the car's limitations or suffer the consequences of overheated cylinders and an exhausted cooling system. Yet, despite these issues, the Fiero Iron Duke cultivated a peculiar devotion among its drivers. People loved the car's look, the way it drew attention at traffic lights, how it seemed futuristic even in the mid-1980s, and how it recalled a more glamorous era of Pontiac performance. Older enthusiasts often bought them reluctantly, aware of the engine's temperamental reputation, but still enchanted by the design. Driving it was a mixture of pride and anxiety. Every red light, every long drive, every sunny afternoon brought a mix of joy and worry. The interior, while modest, contributed to the car's dichotomy. It was functional, if austere, with plastics that resisted cracking better than some contemporaries, but the mid-engine layout made maintenance an ongoing challenge. Checking fluids or performing routine repairs often required contortions more common in a race shop than a suburban driveway. Yet owners accepted these inconveniences as part of the bargain for having such a striking, head-turning vehicle. Ultimately, the 1984 Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke became emblematic of the 1980s American sports car paradox. It looked spectacular, promising excitement and flair. Yet beneath the surface, it was fragile, unreliable, and occasionally dangerous. Owners quickly learned to treat it with caution, especially on long drives or hot summer days. Decades later, the Iron Duke remains a cautionary tale, a car that thrilled the eye but tested nerves, a reminder that style alone cannot replace engineering competence. As one longtime owner summed it up, "You drove it with your heart, but always kept one eye on the engine." The 1985 Chrysler LeBaron with the early turbocharged engines arrived in a period of transition for American cars. The mid-1980s marked a time when buyers wanted efficiency without sacrificing excitement. and Chrysler promised a car that could deliver both. The LeBaron's styling reflected that ambition. Sleek, understated, and modern, with a poised elegance that appealed to older buyers who wanted a vehicle that looked respectable at church, at the office, or on a leisurely weekend drive. Its trim was simple yet refined, with comfortable seats, soft-touch plastics, and a layout designed for ease of use. At first glance, it seemed like a small luxury sedan that could hide a secret under the hood, a hidden performance capability tucked beneath a conservative exterior. And that promise was real, at least on the surface. The turbocharged 2.2-liter engine was capable of surprisingly brisk acceleration for its size. A careful push on the pedal produced a surge of torque that could make a driver momentarily forget the car's modest front-wheel drive chassis. The LeBaron could feel alive in traffic, and in a decade when many American cars were lumbering, it seemed to offer a taste of European-style driving dynamics. Owners could imagine themselves cruising the suburban streets with confidence, turning heads at stoplights, and feeling a sense of pride that their American car could match the thrill of an import. Yet the reality of owning a turbocharged LeBaron was far more complicated. The turbocharger itself, a relatively new technology for mainstream American vehicles, generated extreme heat. Chrysler's engineering, though ambitious, had not perfected the systems needed to keep it stable under prolonged stress. Owners quickly learned that the temperature gauge was not just a suggestion, it was a lifeline. On sunny afternoons or during long stretches of highway, the needle would creep upward relentlessly, rising faster than the speedometer. Some drivers reported that even gentle city driving could make the engine blush with heat, and the consequence of ignoring it could be catastrophic. Hoses would rupture, turbo seals would fail, and oil lines would overheat. In some worst-case scenarios, engines caught fire, transforming a fun day's drive into a dangerous ordeal. One owner recalled, "I had a fire extinguisher in the trunk, and I used it once, thankfully just smoke, but that car had a temper I never forgot." The engine also demanded a meticulous approach to maintenance. Oil levels, coolant, and hose integrity needed constant monitoring, while aftermarket solutions became a popular, if expensive, way to reduce the risk of failure. Cold mornings were particularly stressful, as the turbocharger required careful warming before the engine could safely deliver power. Even starting the car could be anxiety-inducing for cautious drivers. Families hoping to use the LeBaron for long trips quickly learned that planning routes, stopping for engine checks, and pacing acceleration were as much a part of the driving experience as steering or braking. Inside, the LeBaron maintained the image of refinement, but the cabin could not entirely shield occupants from the car's mechanical quirks. Vibrations and occasional hissing sounds from the turbo reminded drivers that they were piloting a vehicle that demanded respect. Passengers often experienced the odd combination of comfort and anxiety. Cushioned seats, quiet cabin, and stylish interior on one hand, with the faint smell of overheated oil and a trembling dashboard on the other. Even routine tasks like stopping at traffic lights or driving uphill became exercises in vigilance. Mechanics, too, had their own stories. Every early LeBaron turbo seemed to have its own personality. Some ran reliably for months, others faltered after days. Troubleshooting required patience, intuition, and sometimes luck. Owners often formed informal networks, sharing tips about cooling systems, recommended oil types, or subtle driving techniques to reduce the risk of failure. One longtime technician joked, "Working on these cars is like babysitting a dragon, beautiful when calm, terrifying when angry." Despite its temperamental nature, the LeBaron Turbo retained a devoted following. Drivers who understood its quirks loved it for the moments when everything worked in harmony. On a clear day, with the turbo performing perfectly, the car could accelerate briskly, hold corners surprisingly well, and deliver a sense of excitement few American sedans of the era could match. Older buyers in particular appreciated the combination of style, comfort, and the fleeting thrill of a turbo engine that responded without warning. But those moments were punctuated by frustration. Overheating could interrupt a road trip, engine failures could leave drivers stranded, and the anxiety of constantly monitoring gauges became a part of the routine. For many, the LeBaron became a love-hate relationship, adored for its looks, its potential, and the occasional rush of speed, yet feared for its unpredictable mechanical temperament. In retrospect, it stands as a testament to the ambitions and limitations of early American turbocharging. Chrysler sought to blend efficiency, luxury, and performance in a single car, but the technology was simply ahead of its time. Decades later, older drivers remember the LeBaron with both fondness and exasperation. They recall the thrill of smooth highways punctuated by the turbo's surge, the nervous glances at the temperature gauge, and the quiet satisfaction of a car that could occasionally behave like the spirited performer it promised to be. One seasoned owner summed it up perfectly. It looked like a dream, drove like a gamble, and kept you humble every mile. But when it ran right, oh, it was glorious.
The 1986 Ford Taurus arrived as a bold new direction for American sedans. Ford wanted something fresh, modern, and aerodynamic, a car that could compete with Japanese and European imports without sacrificing the comfort and space American families had come to expect. Its rounded shape, wide stance, and roomy interior made it immediately stand out in a world of boxy 1980s sedans. Older drivers who remembered the days of long hoods, big V8s, and sweeping chrome were intrigued. This was different, but it felt like a practical evolution rather than a radical experiment. On paper, it promised reliability, efficiency, and comfort, the kind of modern mid-size car that could carry a family to work, school, and weekend trips with ease. But the base 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine turned out to be the Achilles heel of this new era. It was a competent engine in theory, simple, economical, and lightweight. In practice, it was temperamental and unforgiving. Head gasket failures became notorious, haunting owners with expensive repairs that often came unexpectedly. Drivers who bought the base engine hoping for a dependable daily commuter were instead introduced to a world of constant vigilance. A small oil leak, a slight overheat, or a few neglected maintenance items could turn a simple repair into a full-blown engine overhaul. Even when running, the engine's character was unsettling. At stoplights, it would vibrate and shake so violently that drivers half-joked it might leap from the hood. The car seemed nervous, shivering in place as if the engine itself were questioning the point of idling. Passengers often remarked on the rattling and shuddering, and it left many older drivers feeling like they had stepped into a car with more mechanical anxiety than calmness. The once promising smoothness of modern design felt undercut by this constant reminder that the base engine was straining to keep up. Acceleration, too, was modest. The four-cylinder was adequate for city driving, but merging onto highways required careful timing and patience. Hills and fully loaded trips exposed the engine's limitations, forcing drivers to plan routes and sometimes sacrifice speed for safety. The result was a paradox, a car that looked modern and capable, but delivered performance that often felt like it was struggling just to meet expectations.
On the maintenance side, the engine's quirks were relentless. Cooling systems, timing belts, and head gaskets demanded strict adherence to service schedules. Owners quickly learned that ignoring small issues could lead to catastrophic consequences. Mechanics became all too familiar with this little four-cylinder, finding that while some engines could soldier on for years, others failed dramatically with little warning. The Taurus, ambitious and forward-thinking in design, relied heavily on drivers respecting these mechanical realities, an expectation many did not anticipate for a brand-new, mid-priced family car. Despite all this, the Taurus had undeniable strengths. Its interior was spacious, ergonomically designed, and more comfortable than many contemporary imports. Ride quality was generally smooth, handling predictable, and visibility excellent. It was, in essence, a very good car, but only if paired with the right engine, preferably the more powerful V6. For those stuck with the base 2.5 four-cylinder, the experience was a mix of practicality and persistent anxiety, tempered by the occasional smooth cruise when the engine decided to cooperate. Over time, the 1986 Taurus 2.5 four-cylinder became a cautionary tale. It was a car that promised modernity, reliability, and comfort, but delivered mechanical tension and recurring repairs. Older drivers still remember the nervous shudder at every stoplight, the constant glances at the temperature and oil gauges, and the careful approach needed to keep the engine healthy. It was a vision of the future, hampered by an underpowered and fragile heart. A reminder that a good idea on paper does not always translate to smooth, worry-free reality. One longtime owner summed it up simply: "It looked smart, felt roomy, but that little engine kept you humble every single day."
The 1987 Chevrolet Celebrity was everywhere during its heyday, practically unavoidable on suburban streets, in mall parking lots, and outside schools. At first glance, it seemed like the quintessential American family car of the late 1980s, spacious, practical, and familiar. Its boxy yet approachable design, the recognizable Chevrolet bow tie, and a roomy interior gave it the appearance of reliability and comfort. To older drivers accustomed to the heavy, solid American sedans of the 1960s and 1970s, the Celebrity seemed like a natural evolution. A modern car that retains some of the understated sturdiness of the past while embracing a slightly more aerodynamic contemporary look. Its squared-off hood, straightforward grille, and large windows promised visibility, ease of entry, and a comfortable cabin where parents could carry kids, groceries, and luggage with no fuss. But once behind the wheel, the reality was often a shock to those who had expected the dependable workhorse feel Chevrolet had cultivated for decades. Steering was loose and imprecise, giving the impression that the car could drift across the lane at any moment. On long highway stretches, drivers found themselves constantly correcting, the car meandering slightly as if unsure of its own direction. Strong crosswinds amplified the effect, and even gentle turns made the body lean excessively. What should have been a stable, confident ride often felt tentative and uncertain, leaving drivers tense even on short trips. The soft suspension, while seemingly cushy and comfortable for passengers, contributed to the car's unsettled demeanor, exaggerating bumps, dips, and imperfections in the road. The most notorious problem, however, came from the transmissions. Chevrolet's automatic gearboxes in the Celebrity were known for failing suddenly and without warning. A smooth drive could turn into a nightmare when the car hesitated to shift, lurched unexpectedly, or refused to engage certain gears entirely.
For many families, the transmission became a source of persistent anxiety. Road trips required planning, keeping a close eye on the tachometer and shift behavior, and sometimes avoiding hills or traffic-heavy areas that might exacerbate the problem. Mechanics across the country became familiar with repeat visits from celebrity owners, often for identical transmission issues that could not be reliably predicted or prevented. Some families went through multiple replacement units over a few years, while others experienced complete failures on busy streets or highways, leaving them stranded in inconvenient or even dangerous situations. Even beyond steering and transmission woes, the celebrity was plagued by a combination of other quirks that undermined confidence. Electrical gremlins caused flickering gauges and inconsistent interior lighting. Small dashboard rattles proliferated over time, and minor suspension components wore out faster than expected, producing creaks and squeaks that reminded owners of the car's fragility. What initially appeared to be a simple, modern family sedan revealed itself as a car that required constant attention, careful driving, and vigilant maintenance. Yet, despite its flaws, the celebrity maintained popularity for a while, largely because of its accessibility and practicality on paper. It offered a comfortable interior with enough seating and cargo space for families, reasonable fuel economy for its size, and a familiar, unpretentious look. Many owners learned to navigate the car's peculiarities, developing routines and workarounds to mitigate problems. Some carried spare transmission fluid, checked the steering and suspension more frequently, and planned trips with extra care, particularly on highways and in areas with steep grades. For those willing to tolerate its quirks, the car did manage to perform the basic duties expected of a family vehicle, transporting children, groceries, and belongings from one point to another, mostly without catastrophic failure, though rarely without stress. For older drivers who experienced the celebrity firsthand, memories are often bittersweet. They recall the uneasy feeling of merging onto highways with loose steering, the nervous glances at the transmission as it shifted under load, and the small jolts from a soft suspension that seemed to exaggerate every imperfection in the road. They remember the frustration of repeated visits to mechanics, the expense of replacement transmissions, and the sense that, despite its prevalence, the car simply wasn't built to inspire confidence. Some families abandoned the celebrity entirely after just a few years, often leaving it by the roadside or trading it in for a more reliable, if not less stylish, vehicle.
The 1989 Dodge Daytona arrived with high hopes and a sporty look that made young buyers' hearts race. Its sleek, wedge-shaped body, low stance, and sharp lines made it seem ready to compete with imports like the Honda CRX, Toyota Supra, or even European coupes. On paper, it was a car that promised excitement, a taste of performance, and the thrill of driving something that looked ready for the track. Older drivers who remembered the muscle car era of the 1970s saw a bold, modern evolution, a small coupe that aimed to capture some of the flash and spirit of earlier American performance cars. But the reality of the base-engine Daytona quickly revealed itself to be a major letdown. The 2.2-liter four-cylinder under the hood was woefully underpowered for a car with such aggressive styling. Acceleration was sluggish at best, leaving drivers pressing the gas pedal and waiting, sometimes impatiently, for the car to respond. Passing on highways required careful timing, and merging into traffic often felt like a test of patience. For young drivers expecting a zippy, responsive sports car, the reality
was deflating. Beyond the sluggish engine, the Daytona suffered from fragile electronics. Dash gauges misbehaved, the radio and lighting circuits occasionally failed, and sensors that should have guided the engine or transmission often delivered inconsistent readings. Owners quickly learned that warning lights could illuminate for no apparent reason, flickering displays were common, and minor electrical quirks became a persistent source of irritation. Every small electrical problem reminded drivers that, beneath the shiny, sporty exterior, the car was fragile and prone to headaches. Inside, the Daytona's interior did little to inspire confidence. Cheap plastics, rattling panels, and seats that shifted on bumpy roads created an unsettling driving experience. Even when stationary, the cabin emitted small creaks and groans, as though the car itself were complaining about the journey ahead. For a vehicle meant to excite, the experience of sitting inside often felt underwhelming or even frustrating. Passengers could hear every small vibration and every poorly fastened panel, reminding everyone that the car's sporty appearance was largely cosmetic. The base Daytona also handled poorly relative to its competitors. Steering was light but vague, and the suspension, tuned more for comfort than precision, allowed body roll to dominate in corners. On twisty roads, the Daytona felt unbalanced, with understeer and a lack of feedback from the tires, undermining any illusion of sportiness. Drivers who hoped for a car that would deliver a punchy, connected feel found themselves disappointed, struggling to coax performance from a chassis that was designed more for looks than handling. Despite these flaws, the Daytona did have a few redeeming qualities. Its styling turned heads, and its aerodynamic shape was impressive for the era. Some drivers appreciated the roomy hatchback layout and the sense of being in a futuristic car that looked far faster than it actually was. Yet these were minor consolations for a vehicle that promised a lot and failed to deliver. Mechanics and owners quickly became familiar with common repairs, fragile wiring, failing sensors, and interior trim that needed constant attention. The car's reputation for being underpowered, noisy, and easily rattled made it a cautionary tale for performance-seeking buyers. In the end, the 1989 Dodge Daytona with the base engine is remembered as one of the great disappointments of its decade. It looked the part of a sports car, but delivered the soul of a heavy, nervous economy coupe. Young buyers who imagined roaring down streets or taking sharp corners with confidence were met instead with sluggish acceleration, creaking panels, and electronics that seemed to have their own mind of their own. Older drivers, looking back, recall the Daytona as a car that promised excitement but required patience, care, and a sense of humor just to survive daily driving. As one longtime owner reflected, it looked fast, but it felt tired. Every ride was a lesson in expectation versus reality.